Now, though, it's time for Woman's Hour with Aasmah.
Good morning. First, life with an undiagnosed brain infection, the woman who was told that her brain was on fire. At 24, New Yorker Susannah Cahalan was living many young women's dream. A great job as a journalist, a loving boyfriend and a cool flat in a fashionable part of the city. Then her behaviour changed. She developed acute psychosis and her continued decline baffled doctors. There was even talk of confining her to a psychiatric ward. Luckily, a doctor eventually diagnosed her illness, anti-NMDA-receptor autoimmune encephalitis, a rare condition that at that point had only been identified in 216 people in the world. Susannah has chronicled her illness in her book, Brain on Fire, My Month of Madness. She joins me in the studio. Also on the line is Tom Solomon, Professor of Neurology, specialising in encephalitis and Director of the Institute of Infection and Global Health at the University of Liverpool. Thank you both for joining us. Susannah, first of all, just explain, when did you know something was wrong?
You know, it all began kind of subtly. I just felt off. You know, I had these kind of paranoid thoughts that weren't existing before, but it wasn't enough for me to be really scared and see a doctor. So it just, I just thought my boyfriend's cheating on me. I thought, I suddenly couldn't really concentrate at work. So it was very subtle at first.
At what point did it get serious enough for you or your boyfriend to decide that you needed to go to hospital?
You know, it was a point when I started actively kind of seeing things and acting paranoid, and then I had a seizure. So that at that point, it was, you need to go see a doctor now.
Just explain what happened. I mean, you probably obviously don't remember, but I'm sure your boyfriend will. What happened at that point?
You know, that night we were watching TV, and it had been about a week since I had slept. So I was really on edge, and I wasn't acting like myself. And we went to sleep, and all of a sudden, Stephen woke up to this kind of grunting sound, a primal, visceral sound that he's never heard from anyone before. And he looked at me and my eyes were wide open, but I was unseeing. I mean, it was just a blank stare. And then suddenly my arms just jutted out in front of me and I began to shake and blood and foam came out of my mouth. And he had the presence of mind, amazingly, to call 911 and to get me to a hospital.
What did they say when you got there?
Unfortunately, they said people have seizures and they let me go. So that was my first entrance into the hospital. I later went in again after I kept having seizures.
How often were you having them?
I mean, now they look back, I was having them very often. It would range. I would have what's called a grand mal seizure, which is what I described, that kind of full-bodied seizure. And there are other types of seizures where they're basically staring episodes. So they're more subtle.
And what were the thoughts that were going through your mind? Because you talked about feeling paranoid that your boyfriend was cheating on you, but you also had thoughts about your father as well, didn't you?
Oh, yes. As the disease progressed, I began to actively hallucinate. And one of those first hallucinations, I was at my father's house. And at this point, I had had several seizures. And at one point, I believed that he had kidnapped me. And I had created this elaborate kind of situation in my mind. And, I remember some of the hallucinations, but a lot of it's told to me too. But I remember feeling fear, and I thought he was going to try to kill me. And I remember, clawing and kind of pounding at the door, trying to get out of his house because he had actually locked me into the house because I was trying to escape so many times. But I remember running into the bathroom and almost jumping out the window.
You had several diagnoses. Many doctors saw you. Lots of money was spent. Lots of tests were done. What kind of things did people think that was wrong with you? What did they diagnose you with? Incorrectly, as it turned out.
Yes, I mean, the first diagnosis that I got after my seizures was actually that I was partying too much and that I was working too hard. So the doctor said, knock off the drinking, knock off work, take it easy at work, and it should go away. And it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And so my mom thrust a list of, these are all of her, symptoms. This doesn't make any sense. And he still insisted. But, eventually I was able to actually get back into the hospital and where I was ultimately diagnosed.
Tell me about the moment that you got the correct diagnosis. This was a particular doctor who came in, told you to do a particular thing on a piece of paper. Take me through that.
I mean, it's pretty incredible. Now, I don't remember any of this because at that point, so the disease, how it progressed was that, I was acutely psychotic at the height, hallucinating, paranoid, violent, trying to escape, at that point, at the height of the disease. But as it started to continue, I became catatonic. I didn't have any I didn't have any emotional register. I was staring off. I couldn't read or write. So that's where I am at that point. I don't have any memory. But Dr. Najjar, who ultimately diagnosed me, came in and did something no other doctor had done. He asked me to draw a clock. A very simple test. And there had been about $1 million worth of tests during that time. So it was just a free, very simple thing. And I drew all the numbers, 1 through 12, all on the right-hand side of the clock.
So the left-hand side was empty, was blank.
Completely empty, which showed him at that point that the right-hand side of my brain was impaired. And he actually brought my parents outside of the room, out of earshot of me, and he said, her brain is on fire. And he just knew it from this one simple test.
And this was, the correct name for this is anti-NMDA-receptor autoimmune encephalitis. It's a bit of a mouthful.
Oh, yes, yes.
But that's what you were diagnosed with. And Professor Solomon, just explain exactly what this illness does to someone and their brain.
Well, encephalitis means inflammation and swelling of the brain, and it can be caused by a range of different causes. And it's basically, in this case, it's the body's immune system, it's the body's defense system attacking part of the brain, and in particular, these NMDA receptors, which are receptors on nerves.
Just explain, why does it happen in some people and not others?
Well, we're not sure why it always happens. In some people, particularly young women, it can actually be caused by an ovarian tumour, which makes these antibodies. I don't think that was the case in Susannah's case, and most often we don't actually know why the bodies started to make these antibodies. But the other form of encephalitis is encephalitis when there is a particular infection in the brain, and then the body is trying to fight that infection. And the most common infectious cause of encephalitis is caused by herpes viruses.
Right. And what is the treatment for this?
Well, it depends on the cause. So for herpes encephalitis, we treat that with antivirus drugs. When the encephalitis is caused by NMDA receptor antibodies or autoimmune encephalitis, then we treat it with anti-inflammatory drugs such as steroids and intravenous immunoglobulin and other immunosuppressive drugs.
Susannah, what was your treatment and how quickly did you get back on track?
That was precisely what my treatment was. It was steroids and, and basically immune regulators. And it took about, I was diagnosed in April of 2009, and it took for me to get back to work until about September of 2009, which is very fast compared to other people who have survived autoimmune encephalitis. But, it took another probably 8 months after that, another 8 months after that for me to feel fully myself again. So it's a long road. I think the average time for for the anti-NMDA type of autoimmune encephalitis is about 14 months.
But I think the other important thing in Susannah's case is that it does quite often take a while before people recognise that this is encephalitis. And this is because it's a relatively rare condition. But we're doing work to try and get doctors and nurses to recognise the features a little bit earlier so that patients like Susannah will be recognised earlier.
I think at the point that you were diagnosed, Susannah, you were something like only the 217th person in the world that had this specific diagnosis.
That had been diagnosed. There are people out there who had it who had not been diagnosed. The disease itself was named in 2007. So it's a very newly discovered disease. And
Professor Solomon, we know from Susannah's experience and other reading that we've done on this subject that there can be, when you are manifesting the symptoms of encephalitis, that you can sometimes be misdiagnosed with things like schizophrenia.
That's right, and I think that applies to any form of encephalitis. So although NMDA encephalitis is very rare, if you put together all the different types of encephalitis, it's not that rare, and we should be better at recognising it. And we do now have national guidelines which we're encouraging doctors to use to help them spot these conditions. But for any rare disease like this, you do need to pool your resources, and for this reason we have specialist clinics at centres like the Walton Centre where we are in Liverpool, which look after especially patients who've had encephalitis and other brain infections.
You talked about those guidelines. You actually wrote them, didn't you? The UK national guidelines.
Yes, with a group of about 20 others. I chaired the group that wrote them. But in fact, even guidelines alone often isn't enough, because one problem for doctors is they're faced with guidelines for all sorts of conditions. So we're now doing research to try and understand why people have difficulties diagnosing conditions like this and improving their ability to diagnose such conditions.
And what is the recovery like, or the chances of a complete recovery, as Susannah appears to have had, for patients who are diagnosed with the various forms of encephalitis, Professor?
Well, for NMDA encephalitis, it's about 75% of patients make a good recovery, and obviously the sooner it's diagnosed and the sooner treatment started, the better patients will do. The same applies for viral encephalitis. If you spot somebody with herpes encephalitis early and get them treated with antiviral drugs, then they tend to do well. But one important aspect of the treatment and the recovery is that people need a lot of support because these are rare conditions, and for that reason we always refer people to the Encephalitis Society, which is a society made up of people who've been affected by diseases like this, so that they can share their experiences.
And Susannah, with you writing this book, and also you wrote articles in the paper that you worked for. You've had a lot of people getting in touch with you. What has that experience been like? Because a lot of people will take some hope from this, but then there will be others who perhaps are pinning their hopes on this being the thing that's wrong with them, but it might not be.
I've had both experiences. I've had experiences where people who might have actually have a mental illness, looking for an answer because they're desperate for an answer. But I've also had I've had the experience of helping people find a diagnosis. So, either way, I think it's important to get this out there, this word of, this kind of disease and how neurological diseases can present as psychiatric. That's an important thing to kind of pass along.
Yeah, and just finally, because I'm so curious, Susannah, are you now completely back to inverted commas normal, to the way you were before all of this started?
I would say yes. It's hard. I've proven to be such a terrible judge of myself throughout this whole process. It's impossible to really know, but I don't feel that I'm impaired cognitively, so yes, I would say yes.
But Susannah's also a very good beacon, really, for those who are affected, to show that you can get back to normal if given time. And I have a patient at the moment who I've just discharged, and it was good to be able to say, look at what happened to Susannah. You need to give it time because things will improve.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both very much. That was Professor Tom Solomon, and you also heard from Susannah Cahalan, whose book Brain on Fire, My Month of Madness is published by Particular Books on the 7th of February. And for more information, you can go to either the Women's Hour website, which is www.bbc.co.uk/Women's Hour, and also www.encephalitis.info.